There are numerous threats to the farms that are the backbone of our state, from global commodity markets to Mother Nature. Tonight we'll talk about agriculture and how to sustain it into the future. I'm Perry Strathern. Welcome to the third episode of Fairfax Media's federal election debate for Country SA. With me are Family First Senator Bob Day, Labor MP Nick Champion, Liberal Senator Anne Ruston, Senator Nick Xenophon and Senator Robert Sims from the Greens. Thank you. Our first question tonight, one pressure for primary producers, is the spectre of mining companies coming to take control of their land. I'll ask you first, Robert Sims. Are we doing enough to protect farmland from mining?
No, I don't think we are. And one of the things that the Greens have been really concerned about is effectively vested interests coming in and taking control of farmers' land and destroying their natural assets. And, you know, we've been seeing that with coal seam gas, for instance. And my colleague Larissa Waters has had a bill before Parliament to ensure that that can't happen and to ensure that farmers aren't having their rights taken away. What really concerns us about that is, you know, South Australia in particular has developed a reputation as a leader when it comes to producing a clean, green, local produce, and providing healthy environments. And all of those things are put at risk if this kind of thing is allowed to go ahead without appropriate oversight. And so that's why we've been advocating for action to be taken on this.
I'll go Anne Ruston and then Nick Xenophon.
Look, I mean, I think we have to be realistic about this. Our land and what is contained within that land is a shared resource, and there are some very valuable minerals under the soil in South Australia, under South Australia's land, and the people of South Australia have a right to be able to get access to the economic benefit from that. But I think we can coexist, but what we need to do is to make sure that we coexist in the most positive and beneficial way we can. I think we need to try and introduce greater transparency into what's actually going on in terms of negotiations with mining companies and farmers. And I think as a state that we need to decide what it is we actually want mining to look like in the future. Many other states have got legislation in place that actually defines what the role of mining is and what the role of agriculture and what the rights of each of the parties are. I think that probably the smartest thing that South Australia could do to give some certainty back to the farming sector that they're not going to be raped and pillaged by mining companies is actually to legislate so that the rules and regulations and then particularly transparency about what happens in our mining sector is known to our farmers so that they can go forward with some certainty.
Nick Xenophon.
Look, we need to have, there is a balancing act, but from my point of view, if you're putting agriculture at risk with mining, then agriculture, prime agricultural land, needs to come up trumps in relation to that for a whole range of reasons. I mean, agriculture is our ultimate renewable resource. We can't do anything that will affect the water table. I know farmers in the grape growers and farmers in the Coonawarra are worried about some of the drilling taking place there. The water trigger mechanism in federal legislation doesn't actually apply to that sort of drilling, and I believe that it should, because you have that precautionary approach in terms of that. And also in Eyre Peninsula, where they're talking about open-cut iron ore mines, where if some dust lands on wheat crops, those wheat crops are pretty useless for any market. We need to be incredibly cautious about this, and I don't think farmers' rights have been sufficiently heard.
Agriculture first, says Senator Xenophon. What does Family First say to that?
Oh, look, I don't have much to add, except once again the governments have mucked it up. You know, take in America, for example, where if you own the land, then you own everything under it as well. In Australia, for some reason, farmers, landowners own the top 6 inches, and everything under it is owned by somebody else. Here we are now having to make the best of a bad situation.
And Nick Champion.
Well, they're not owned by somebody else. They're owned. These resources are owned by the Australian people, and they're vested in governments. We get the royalties from exploiting these resources, and it's because they're under the ground and part of the nation's natural wealth. That is why the Crown is predominant in this instance. And to argue, as Bob does, where some individual farmer should hit a massive payday because he happens to have oil or gas underneath the farm is ridiculous and would be a retrograde step. But it's clear that we do have to have sensible measures to protect the environment. In the case of shale gas, there should be a mechanism under the EPBC Act to look at the water table. Those were changes that were instituted by the last Labor government for other gas projects. We need to be environmentally sensible. We need to properly exploit these resources because they are our collective and shared natural economic inheritance. And in this state, we have a mining warden who generally spends their time negotiating between farmers and mining companies. Obviously, that's a balance that has to be met, but it's in our national interest that it is.
Can I just respond? It's not ridiculous. It's no different to Western Mining pegging a tenement of land and then drilling a hole, discovering a rich ore body called Olympic Dam, and then they've owned that resource. That's no different whether it's a mining company or a landowner.
We get the royalty off of it.
But
royalties don't affect it. There'll still be a royalty aspect to it.
look, dovetailing on what Bob has said, there's a big issue here as to whether farmers should have a right of veto over developments that could impact on their primary agricultural land.
Access to
Well,
royalties.
Nick, if you're talking about jobs in South Australia, you can't say that you're going to introduce, in effect, a single owner veto over mining development.
Why would they veto
Bob, these are valuable resources for the nation to exploit and for the state to exploit. They are critical to our overall economic growth and critical to jobs. We used to have 3 mines in the state, now we have 20. If we introduce a single person or a single family veto on these projects, that would be a big inhibitor on jobs.
I just want to, and I think that's the last thing to be an inhibitor on jobs, but there is a real issue about the impact on that farmland. You need to look at the costs and the benefits, whether there ought to be a proper compensation mechanism if a mining development, if a drilling development.
But that's different from a veto. You said a veto.
Well, I think that in the case that there ought to be more safeguards in place for those farmers, because at the moment the level of compensation they get can be pretty inadequate, and their negotiating strength and negotiating powers are pretty limited.
There's obviously a balance to be struck, and I'm sure that in the Senate you'll play a part in that, and in the House. Mr Champion, you spoke about government interests. Foreign ownership is another issue that's on the forefront of a lot of people's minds in the ag sector. What do you think of the way that it's handled in Australia at the moment?
Well, there tends to be a high level of agitation about it, and historically there always has been, about British investment in the 1930s. You can read a lot of commentary about Lord Vestey back in the day, and about American investment, about Japanese investment. I think in the 80s was highly topical at the time. And now we have, the spectre of Chinese foreign investment. Interestingly enough, the Foreign Investment Review Board was actually instituted when the Americans bought the Chico Roll company. So I mean, this is an old story. People get very agitated about it. I've got to say, I've seen many rural communities where it's been absolutely essential to actually make companies grow and to see jobs and wealth created. And so I think we tend to want to have our cake and eat it as well. There needs to be sensible national interest tests applied, but what we don't want is hysterical campaigns run against foreign investment, because overall it's been a good thing for Australia.
Nick Xenophon.
It's not hysterical to have a proper national interest test. It hurts me to say this, but the Kiwis across the Tasman seem to have got it right compared to us, in the sense that their foreign investment framework is much more transparent, it's much clearer, it sets out what the national interest is rather than the political considerations of the day. And I also think that something like S. Kidman and Co. should not be sold off, given that it is our biggest piece of private landholding in this country, 1.1% of our land mass, over 2% of our agricultural land. So there are some big issues there. How do we deal with this, the sort of investment that Nick Champion talks about? We need to allow our super funds to have the sorts of incentives of, just to use a sliver of that $300 billion that's overseas, some of that to come back here to turbocharge Australian agriculture.
Robert Sims.
Yeah, it's not about being anti-foreign investment. It's about ensuring that there's some transparency around who is owning these assets, and I think Australians and South Australians have a right to know what foreign interests are at work, and it's totally appropriate that they get that information. So we need to have that being made available to the public and a register of those interests. It's also an issue with respect to water rights as well, and actually something that the Greens negotiated with the government was for there to be a national register with respect to water licences that are foreign owned, so that again people have an opportunity to know and have some oversight over those investments.
Is more transparency the answer?
Yes, I think it is. Family First is a great believer in the motto of everybody knowing everything all the time. We are very strong advocates of a clear register and transparency, and there is a lot of hype, as Nick has said on this, and others have said. There seems to be a lot of uncertainty and hype around the fears. Chinese taking over our land. The majority of ownership in Australia of land is Americans and Canadians and the British. And I think so long as that we all know and it's clear and transparent, I don't think we'll have too many problems.
Anne Ruston.
Well, the majority of land in Australia is owned by Australians, not by Americans, Canadians or others.
Foreigners.
However, the majority of foreign ownership is owned by countries people in countries other than China. But I think one of the most fundamental things that we have to accept here is that we have put forward growth projections for Australia, particularly in our agricultural sector, that we will never be able to meet unless we get foreign investment. So I think the first thing we have to accept that is foreign investment is absolutely essential if we are going to deliver what we are promising to deliver in terms of the economies of the future. Quite rightly, I think this shouldn't be a debate about foreign investment. This should be a debate about national interest. And I know that if we can get greater understanding out in the wider community that whenever a decision is made to allow foreign investment or foreign ownership, that it has been done so in the national interest, I think we'll get a lot more comfort, because we hear a lot of hysteria, which is really quite unfortunate. I mean, I visited this week one of the most amazing developments in horticulture, Sundrop Farms up near Port Augusta. Not 1 cent of that money is actually Australian money. It's all been invested by Belgium. Not a word from anybody about the fact that we've invested $250 million worth of Belgian money into Port Augusta. That's all good. So I think we need to be very careful that we don't actually create a hysterical argument about this, and make sure that we provide as much information as we can. We do have a register of foreign ownership, and we're certainly looking at a register for foreign water ownership, but we also need to realise what a minute proportion of Australian land and Australian water is not owned by Australians.
And very briefly to finish, it would be remiss of me not to mention the dairy industry with the condition that it's in at the moment. Do any of our panellists have a solution to the price troubles that are plaguing that industry?
Can I just raise a few issues in relation to that? Back in 2011 on Australian Day, when Coles instigated this, I think, quite reckless milk price war, soon followed by Woolworths, it devalued dairy as a product. It was used as collateral damage in a market share war between Coles and Woolworths, which raises some bigger issues about competition laws in this country and the size of the supermarket duopoly. A combination of the $1 milk, the discounted milk, a combination of a collapse in the export prices led to a crisis in our dairy sector. We cannot afford to let those farmers go off the land. Down to 6,000 dairy farmers nationally, a significant contraction from pre-deregulation. So we need to look at a modest milk levy. We need to look at issues such as Senator John Madigan in Victoria that actually talked about reintroducing the milk program for schools. I think that's a terrific idea. Need to look at ensuring that they have those no-interest loans or concessional loans that the government announced. But on top of that, we need to deal with some of those structural imbalances in the industry, and the way that some of the big players in the dairy sector have been behaving, I think needs to be looked at.
Yeah, we do need to look at competition policy in this country and the really unethical behaviour of Coles and Woolies and the impact that that's having on driving down the price of milk and also really dudding farmers and local producers. You know, it's really troubling that in our country, bottled water now costs more than a carton of milk, and I think a lot of Australians would be appalled by that. So we need to review competition laws and ensure that we get back on track with this.
Well, I always buy Jersey Fresh from Greenock, so give them a bit of a plug. Buy branded milk. That's the surest way to make sure the money goes back to the farm gate. But this is predominantly an issue of world export markets. That's what's dictating the price here. There are some issues around, if you like, the middlemen. I think Coles and Woolies get a appropriate amount of scrutiny for their buying practices, and they need to improve those. But we also do need to look at the fact that there are a couple of big milk conglomerates as middlemen between the farmers and the supermarkets, and some of the issues there need to be investigated by ASIC and by the ACCC. And of course, what we'll need to do, I think, over time is just try and sensibly, through these concessional loans that the government's introduced, support our farmers. But most farmers understand the nature of world commodity markets. They can drop very rapidly, and that is always been an issue in dairy. It's interesting that this is really emanating out of Victoria, which were, of course, the state that led the dairy deregulation process in the late 90s. I think probably some of them are regretting it now.
Any thoughts, Bob Day?
No, just a quick one. In that there is a problem at the moment, and the government is throwing a lot of resources at it. I'm focused more on the long term and the actual cost of running the dairy farms these days. In particular, the cost of power. Once again, the wind farms and others that's driving up, and particularly in South Australia, where we have the highest power prices in the nation. And the cost of running the farms, again, a lot of them are family farms, is something that we're focusing on very, very
reduce costs as much as increase milk prices.
Indeed, yes.
Anne Ruston?
Okay, well, there was a myriad of different comments made by my colleagues in this space, but a couple that I'd pick up on. One is that the public have already responded very generously to the plight of the dairy farmers. You've only got to go into Coles and Woolworths and you'll see all their dollar milk is still sitting on the shelves, and people have now responded and they're buying the branded milk. So I think it is a very positive sign that Australians are prepared to get behind these industries. It's very disappointing that it took this for them to do it, but I think it actually has highlighted to the Australian public that things like dollar milk are in nobody's best interest. But in terms of a milk levy that Senator Xenophon raises, the industry doesn't want a milk levy. The industry has made it quite clear to us that they don't want one. The other point to be made about a milk levy is on fresh milk. The issue that's here is about an international situation, and the price of international is actually on milk solids, it's not on fresh milk. So to put a levy on fresh milk is actually not going to solve the problem. I think we need to look, as was quite rightly mentioned, the middle guys in this space and some of the things they're doing. I think ASIC has a role, because I think some of the behaviour of some of our middle guys has been at best unfair, but possibly we'll let ASIC decide what they determine that it's been. But certainly don't buy dollar milk. That's a good thing, because it's sending a signal to the marketplace. But to decide that we're just going to stick another levy on because we're going to raise some money for the farmers, I do not think is going to provide a long-term solution for the dairy industry.
It's not about a long-term solution, it's about getting people out of a crisis and people not walking off the farm. I think there is a real argument for a levy, particularly on $1 milk.
A temporary levy?
Obviously it must be temporary, and a modest levy. Some people have talked about 50 cents. I think it's way too high. We used to have a levy, I think 11 cents a litre with deregulation. All I'm saying is that you're going to lose a whole generation of dairy farmers unless we make sure that they get that emergency assistance to stop them walking off the land.
We are running out of time, but very quickly, could we cover the issue of drought funding? Obviously, farmers in the southeast of our state and other parts of our state are dealing with a particular dry spell. Are we doing enough to help our drought-stricken farmers?
Well, I'm happy to pick that one up first. The thing that's actually probably caused me the most amount of grief is that the federal government has made available a huge amount of money to the South Australian government to assist our drought-affected farmers with concessional loans so that they can get through this tough spot. What we've seen has been a very rigid assessment of eligibility by the South Australian government, which has meant that many of these loans, which otherwise would have been made available in other states, are being refused in South Australia, which is particularly concerning. I think out of the 50 applications we've had for drought relief funding or concessional funding, only 6 of them have been approved. So I think there is a question to be asked of the South Australian government as to why they're not making more or not approving more of the applications that are being provided.
Nick Champion, do you agree with that?
Well, Anne's the minister, so maybe she should just pick up the phone. I mean, generally speaking, drought assistance in this country has been bipartisan. I know when we were in government, we made every endeavour to involve, in particular, the opposition and the National Party, and try and make this an issue of, not of partisan contention. So I think if there are practical problems with loan applications or whatever, people need to be practical, pick up the phone, talk to state ministers and state bureaucrats and get it sorted, because that's generally what I've found from farmers when they're suffering some degree of distress or because of the conditions on the land. They really want to look past the party and just find politicians who are prepared to help them.
Can I just respond to that and to say that I have had many conversations with the South Australian government about this particular issue and have had no satisfaction. So I can assure you, Nick, the first thing I do whenever I've got an issue that is particular to a state, I will pick up the phone and ring them. They have not responded positively to my calls in this respect.
Perhaps some more negotiations to continue after this episode.
Indeed.
Bob Day.
Yeah, well, once again, the government involvement in this, the South Australian taxpayers and federal taxpayers spent billions of dollars on a desalination plant. I think it's running at nowhere near capacity.
Well, we're talking more about agriculture.
Yeah, I'll get to that, and yet irrigators have had their allocations reduced. As a result, I was deputy chair of the Murray-Darling Basin Senate inquiry, and we had evidence presented to our inquiry that showed that the South Australian government was actually buying water from the Goulburn region rather than running its desalination plant, which was the very reason that taxpayers stumped up the money for that.
We'll talk more about water tomorrow, but in the meantime, Senator Sims.
Well, can I just pick up the point that Bob has made about the Murray-Darling Basin inquiry? I went to some of the inquiry here in South Australia, and it's very clear in terms of dealing with the issues associated with drought that we need to see support for the Murray-Darling Basin plan. That was hard fought, and it was hard to reach consensus a few years ago across all the different political parties, but also within the community, and the plan has been put in place. But then you had Senator Day and a few others that then wanted to open that all up again and really start to create more anxiety for local communities. So we do need to ensure that we have that in place. In terms of the issues around drought and response and dealing with that directly, absolutely drought assistance for communities is critical. But we also, to take us back to some of the comments I raised in a previous episode, is we need to ensure that we have appropriate public funding for support in the community of things like mental health support, which is really critical when people are dealing with the stress that comes from drought.
Look, with drought assistance, it needs to be not just bipartisan but non-partisan. It needs to be timely, it needs to be efficient, it needs to give the emergency assistance that's needed to make sure that farmers don't walk off the land. And of course there are mental health issues that are very important as well. I have heard that there have been issues of administration, that the Commonwealth provides the money to the state government, and there have been some issues in terms of the administration of that funding. That needs to be sorted out sooner rather than later. But broadly, I'm in broad agreement that it needs to be non-partisan and it needs to be timely and effective. Clearly
you can agree that you all need to work together, and I'm sure that we can continue in that direction. Bob Day, you had a very quick
just
thought.
a quick one on Senator Sims's comment about the plan. I mean, no plan, as we know, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And the idea that you would set in motion a plan as complicated as the Murray-Darling Basin plan and then not be prepared to review it is ridiculous. We were receiving harrowing evidence and accounts from farmers and irrigators throughout the basin. It needed to be reviewed, and that's exactly what the committee did.
Well, we're in for a cracker tomorrow night when we return to the Murray-Darling Basin. That's all we have time for now, though. Thank you to our panellists again. Tomorrow we will be talking about the environment, so tune into your local Fairfax Media website or social media channel at 7:30 p.m. For now, good night.